Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's Philippa Foot Society lecture. Today we are fortunate enough to have Professor Alister McGrath of Oxford University delivering a talk on his defence of Christianity in the Dawkins Delusion. So I'm sure you can all appreciate how fortunate we are to have him speaking with us. With that established, please join me in welcoming Professor Alister McGrath.
Good. Well, thank you very much for having me, and I hope your new school year has got off well. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you about this book I wrote with my wife called The Dawkins Delusion. I want to tell you about how it came to be written, and then explore some of the ideas, and then we can talk about some of its weaknesses and where you might want to challenge it, and then we can let you take the conversation any direction you like. So my background is that I was a scientist at Oxford and then switched to the study of theology. I used to be an atheist, then I became a Christian. So in effect, I'm kind of really quite engaged in this whole question about the relationship between science and religion. And of course, this big debate about atheism. And I began to realize this could be quite important back in the early 2000s. And I was asked to speak at a debate in Oxford, and there were three speakers: myself, Richard Dawkins, and another guy called Peter Atkins, who again, like Dawkins, was a scientific atheist. And I found that very interesting, and I began to realize there were lots of interesting questions arising from that. So I wrote a book shortly after that debate, which you may be able to read here. It's called Dawkins' God, and really it's just an examination of what I think Richard Dawkins is saying about science and religion, and how he understands his own distinct position. So in effect, this was just a book I wrote. It is fairly neutral. It's not saying Dawkins is right, Dawkins is wrong. It's just saying here's what Dawkins says about this question. And I didn't really expect that to go any further. But then, as I'm sure you will know, in 2006, Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. And that got a lot of attention. And in the summer of 2006, I was asked by the BBC to, in effect, have a debate with Richard Dawkins on TV. And we did that. It wasn't really very satisfactory. And so I thought I need to write a book, a short book, beginning to respond to some of the questions that Richard Dawkins was asking. So what I'm going to do is just mention four of the main lines of engagement. I'm going to tell you what Dawkins says, what I say in response, and then we'll kind of use that as a basis for our discussion. So here are the main points that Dawkins makes, and here is how I would respond to that. So the first point that Richard Dawkins makes, and again, he's speaking as a scientist and an atheist, is that it's obvious that science and religion are at war with each other. So if science and religion are at war with each other, well, there's nothing to be said. They can't talk to each other. Or if you are a scientist who is religious, then in a certain sense, you're not a very good scientist. You're being a traitor to science. So it's quite a provocative image. And one of the things I say in the Dawkins Delusion is that this really is not taken seriously anymore by historians. It's been known, I think, really since about the 1960s that this is a very difficult thesis to maintain. What scholarship shows you really is that science and religion have a very complex relationship. Sometimes there are points of tension, sometimes there are points of indifference, sometimes there are actually points of synergy. But there's no one way of understanding that relationship. It's not always hostility, indifference, collaboration. It's a complex mix. And so what I want to say is, to begin with, that Dawkins is simply not right to say that science and religion are in conflict. It's a complex thing. They are different. But two things being different does not make them incompatible. To give you a very good example, I mean, I have many friends who are scientists, and they tell me it's really important for scientists to be ethical people. And I would agree, and I'm sure you would as well. But science and ethics are completely different ways of thinking. You can't really use science to establish ethics. But the fact that they are different does not mean that they are incompatible. It just means that you use one way of thinking doing science and a different way of thinking when you're doing ethics. But you can be a scientist and be ethical at one and the same time. So for me, that was an issue, really, that I think Dawkins was in effect saying, by definition, Scientists can't be religious believers. I was saying it's much more complicated than that. And of course, I give lots of examples of very well-known scientific figures who do in fact have religious beliefs. When I was at Oxford as an undergraduate studying chemistry, for example, one of the figures I studied in detail during my first year was Albert Einstein. And Einstein was absolutely convinced that science and religion were completely compatible, and actually you needed them both if you were going to live a meaningful life. So, you know, it's not quite as straightforward as what Dawkins is saying. So that's one point at which I disagree with Richard Dawkins. But I think the second is much more interesting, and it's this. It's all about the question of proof. In other words, can you prove that what you believe is right? And one of Dawkins' arguments goes like this, that a scientist only believes what can be proved, whereas religious people just make things up. They believe anything they like. And that's one of the reasons why Dawkins feels that religion is damaging, because it does not base its beliefs on any evidence. So I think that's really interesting. So let me just begin to engage with this and see what you think. And then, of course, we can talk about this in more detail later. I think the first point to make is this. I agree with Dawkins completely that we need to prove as many of our beliefs as possible. That's particularly true in science, but when it comes to other areas of life, it does get a bit more complicated. For example, moral beliefs, where actually you can't really prove they're right. You've got to say, look, here is how I arrive at this belief that this is good, but I can't actually prove it's right. And one of the points I want to suggest to you is that in many ways, there are lots of areas of life where actually we cannot prove core beliefs. And I don't want to be frightened by the idea. As far as I can see, it's just the way things are. What I'm saying to you is that in life, there are lots of issues like, for example, what is the meaning of life? What is good? How do we live a good life? And I'm sure you could all give good answers to those questions. I could too. But the problem is we can't actually prove what we believe. We can say, I've got some good reasons for saying that, but you can't actually prove it. And that's not really a problem. One of the points I want to stress is that there are some areas of human thought, for example, mathematics and logic, and certain areas of science where you can prove that things are right. But in other areas, you can't. You have to say, here are some good reasons why I think this is right. For example, there's a big debate in astronomy at the moment. Is there only one universe, or rather lots of them? You've probably heard the phrase the multiverse. And you know, there is some evidence for each of those, but you can't prove that either is right. And most of my friends who are astronomers will say, well, we believe this or we believe that, but we know that actually we can't show that we are right. In other words, it's a judgment on our part that this is right, but we can't actually prove that it is true. So I think that is a very important point to make. I agree with Richard Dawkins that where possible, we try to give good reasons for believing that certain things are true, but it isn't always possible to prove things that we believe. And that, I think, is a very important point. I remember many years ago when I was a teenager, I read a book by Bertrand Russell called The History of Western Philosophy. And in that book, he says that in his view, the task of philosophy is simply to enable us to cope with uncertainty without being paralyzed by hesitation. That key phrase, to cope with uncertainty. And interestingly, Bertrand Russell said, look, when it comes to the God question, is there a God, is there not a God? You can't prove it either way. It's as simple as that. Dawkins thinks you can, but I have to say, in his book, The God Delusion, I don't really see any proof that that atheism is right. I simply see some arguments. And there are arguments which you can give, there are arguments you can give against that. But really, it's not something you can hope to prove. Russell himself said, I'm going to live as if there is no God. In other words, he said, I'm an atheist in the sense that I'm going to live my life on the assumption there's no God. But he was quite clear, I can't prove that's right. I think that's where a lot of people, whether they're religious or not religious, are. They say, look, here's what I think. I'm going to live my life this way, but I can't absolutely prove this is right, even though I think I have some good reasons for thinking this. So that, I think, is really quite an important point. So obviously one question would be, well, can I prove there is a God? And the answer is no, of course I can't. I don't think that God is the kind of thing you can prove. What you can say, though, are two things, which I think are both very important. One of them is, for me, that Christianity gives you a way of looking at the world which makes so much sense. Now, those of you who are studying science will know that if you're a scientist, one of the ways in which you can judge a theory is simply this: how well does it work? In other words, here's the theory, here's the observations. How well does the theory make sense of observations? And if you read someone like C.S. Lewis, who's actually quite a good Christian writer, Lewis will talk about, for example, in one of his essays, he talks about the idea of God, in fact, being like a sun. It kind of way lights up the landscape. It helps you to make sense of things. And so one of the things I want to suggest to you is that maybe Christianity is able to make sense of things because it helps us to understand the world we live in and also who we are and why we matter. I think that's a very important point, because I talked a moment ago about the importance of things like meaning and value. And certainly, as many of you will know, Karl Popper, a very well-known philosopher of science, said there are some questions that science just can't answer. He called these ultimate questions. And one of these is, why am I here? What am I meant to be doing? I think those are questions that matter to all of us. I'm sure you've thought about them. But the key point is you can't prove that your answer is right. But what you can do is step inside a way of thinking, like atheism, or in my case, Christianity. And that kind of way begins to give you a sense of what things are all about. And I'll come back to that later. So that's really the second point I want to make. And actually, Dawkins sets out to prove that atheism is right, but I'm afraid he doesn't. He really just, in effect, makes the point it's really good to be able to prove things where you can prove things, like 2 and 2 make 4. But when it comes to deep questions like, what is the meaning of life all about? Is there a God? I'm afraid you can't answer that question. Now, if you want to explore this question in more detail, you could go on YouTube and you could search for Richard Dawkins, Rowan Williams, Oxford. And if you do that, you'll come across a video, which is a recording of a debate between Richard Dawkins and Rowan Williams, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury at Oxford, in 2012. It's really interesting. But what's the most interesting thing is at one point, Dawkins is put under pressure. Can you actually prove that atheism is right? And of course, in the end, he has to say, well, I can't prove that. And I suppose, therefore, in one sense, I'm a kind of agnostic. And that's quite an interesting point. He's quite receptive at that point to the idea he cannot actually prove that his core beliefs are right. And certainly that generated a lot of discussion at the time back in 2012. But let's move on then to a third point, which I think really is quite important. And it's this. It's all to do with if science and religion aren't at war with each other, well then, how do you understand their relationship? I think it's very important to answer that, because this is so important for Richard Dawkins, and it's so important for me as someone who used to be a scientist and who's now a Christian, and of course is Oxford Professor of Science and Religion. So let me just give you two thoughts and see if these make any sense of you. One of them is to say, well, look, these are different, but they offer us different perspectives on our world. In other words, science helps us to understand how things work, but religion or Christianity helps you to understand what they mean. And one of the points I want to make to you is these actually completely different ways of thinking. One is about how things function, another is what things actually mean. And one of the reasons why I think this is quite helpful is that you can see that science and faith can be brought together. One of them is telling us how our world works, but the other answers a deeper question, which is what's this all about? If you like, you can use a scientific lens and a religious lens to look at our world, and when you put them both together, you get stereoscopic vision. And that, I think, is very important. But another point I want to make here is that one of the disagreements that Richard Dawkins and I have is about whether science is able to answer all of our questions. I think that's a very important point. Dawkins argues like this: look, sciences are really good tool. It's very, very good at answering questions about how our world works. And since it works so well there, it can tell us the answers to everything. And scientifically, there is no case for believing in God. So I want just to go with that argument and see where it takes us. I want you to imagine that I'm holding a thermometer in my hand. Now, I'm not, I'm afraid, but just pretend I am. Okay, I'm holding a thermometer. And I say to you, look, this thermometer works really well. It tells me my temperature. It can tell me whether I've got COVID or not. So because it works so well at telling my temperature, I use it for everything. Like, what's the meaning of life? What's good? And you would say that's probably the worst argument I've ever heard, because I mean, you know, saying that something works well here doesn't mean it works well everywhere. And that really is criticism I bring against Dawkins. Science is very, very good at answering scientific questions, but it doesn't really help us with moral or existential or religious questions. I think that is an important point. But then move on now to another point, which I'm sure will be very important for many of you. As I'm sure you know, Dawkins was motivated to write his book, The God Delusion, by an event that happened on the 11th of September 20 years ago in 2001, and we call it 9/11. And that, of course, is when a group of terrorists flew planes into, for example, the World Trade Center in New York and elsewhere. And Dawkins felt this is an example of religiously motivated violence, which shows that, in effect, religion is dangerous. And that is a major theme throughout his book, The God Delusion, that religion is dangerous. And therefore, in effect, the world will be a safer place if we could get rid of religion altogether. And actually, I was quite sympathetic to that when I was an atheist myself back in Northern Ireland in the 1960s when I was growing up. I mean, I could see there was religious tensions occasionally, religious violence, and part of me said, you know, if there was no religion, there'd be no religious violence, although it's actually a bit more complicated than that, because people get violent about lots of things, as I'm sure you will know. But let's go with this, because I think it's a very important point. And one of the things that Dawkins is saying here is that, in effect, religion, in effect, inspires people to commit violence in God's name. In other words, that use God as an excuse to do very violent things. And certainly a lot of people at the time did feel that that was a very significant line of argument, although 20 years later, I have to say, it doesn't really seem quite as persuasive. So let me try and engage this. I want to agree with Dawkins by saying that there are some things that do make people commit violence. It's when, for example, you are deeply committed to something and you feel it's being threatened, and very often use violence when that happens. That's certainly true of some religions, but I'm afraid it's also true of politics and also certain kinds of atheism. And one of the things I wish Dawkins would have talked more about in The God Delusion was the Soviet Union, when it used very repressive anti-religious policies, where violence in effect was used to suppress religion throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. It would just have given a bit more balance to his discussion, because I agree with Dawkins, violence is bad and that some religious people do use violence. But then you see an awful lot of other people do as well. Or again, I wish Dawkins had given some counterexamples. For example, you may know this, you can check it on the web very easily. In October of 2006, actually almost around the same time as Dawkins' book was being published in the United States, a gunman broke into an Amish schoolhouse in Pennsylvania and shot dead, I think it was 6 schoolgirls, a horrible event. The Amish, as I'm sure you know, are a very conservative Protestant sect in North America. They said, we are going to forgive this gunman. That's what Jesus wants to do. That's what we are going to do. And the result is that there was no cycle of violence. There was no retribution. It was the end of the matter. And the gunman's widow, he shot himself, by the way, and just said, look, this gave me the space to rebuild my life. So that's an example of where religious beliefs stop people being violent. They say, we're not going to do that. So really the point I'm trying to make is that Dawkins, I think, needs really to bring much more evidence into discussion, because it's not just that simple. So in a minute, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to give you a chance to begin to, raise some questions. I think that could be really interesting. But let me just reflect a bit more on some of the things that Dawkins is saying. I think one of the points I want to agree with him about is that science is really important. I think that science is one of the most important things we have. And I think, incidentally, the way in which the scientific community has responded to COVID, helping us develop these vaccines here at Oxford, we've been very involved in this, is actually a very important thing. But again, the point is, science can be very, very good at lots of things, but doesn't answer all of our questions, like, why am I here? What am I meant to be doing? What's good? How do I live my life to the best? What am I meant to be doing? I think that's a very important point, that in effect science is useful, but it does have its limits. And very often that is where religion does play a major role. Psychologists will tell you that one of the major roles that religion plays is helping you to make sense of yourself, figuring out who you are, and then working out what is good and what life is all about. And that, I think, does give you a very useful reference point. I'm sure other worldviews can help as well, but certainly it's a very characteristic aspect of religion. But there's one point I think I do want to make in closing, and it's this. And that is that Dawkins offers lots of critiques of religion, but he doesn't really ask the question, why would anybody be religious? I mean, I began life as an atheist. Now I suppose you could say I'm religious. I don't really like that word, because it implies I kind of get all fussed up about religious observance, which I don't. But I think Dawkins needs to ask that question. His answer would be, well, you're just deluded. It's mad. But you see, it's not. It actually is an entirely reasonable, rational way of making sense of our world and then actually living out within it. So one of the points I want to make is that for me, Christianity does make rational sense. It makes sense of what I observe in the world around me, makes sense of what I experience within me, but also gives me this way of understanding myself. So I'll give you one very quick example of that, and then we'll move on just to a time of discussion. Here's a point I want to make. If you're into Christianity, as I am, it tells you, look, actually, what other people think about you doesn't really matter all that much. The important thing is to know you are loved by God, and that kind of gives you a secure base from which you can kind of engage the world. I've always found that very helpful, because it means I don't worry about reputation. I don't worry about having to earn respect and anything like that. Let's get on with what I think is really important in life. And that, I think, is a very important thing to do. But listen, I've probably raised lots of questions, and I'm looking at the clock, and I think I need to stop talking. And instead, I'm going to ask you to take the conversation further, and I'm very happy just to respond to any questions you have. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward now to responding to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming first. It's very good to have you. I was just looking to pick up on your point about the thermometer. I know it was quite a loose analogy, obviously, but I just thought the thermometer obviously is very one-dimensional. I'm not sure science is quite that one-dimensional, and I do potentially think that some of our morals do come from and can be explained by science. For example, just survival, basically. Not killing, picking up on something like natural moral law, which is a Christian ethical theory system, stuff like preserve life, that can be very, obviously taken, I would say, from science, living in an order society. Pack survival is a good method. I would argue that potentially morals can come from scientific beliefs, basically.
So I wouldn't really agree on that one, I'm afraid. I certainly agree that, for example, you can give a Darwinian argument about why morals, shared communal values, particularly pro-social values, are very important. But actually, when it comes to determining what those values are, I mean, that's a different matter altogether. Science generically, I think, can show us. I think psychology is very, very clear. Meaning matters in life. It's very, very clear on that. The empirical evidence, I think, is overwhelming. But empirically, you can't say, and this is what the meaning of life is. You can say meaning matters. That's empirically demonstrable. But then the question is, how does that kind of way help you identify what meaning is, or what moral value system is right? I think that's where you and I think would differ on this. I think scientifically we can say these things really do matter. There's a lot of empirical evidence for that. But in terms of identifying what I think morality is, or what I think the meaning of life is, I'm afraid science isn't really very good on that point. Certainly it can inform our thinking, but it doesn't determine our thinking on that particular point. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Do you believe that Christianity alone is a necessity to fill in the gaps of these ultimate questions that you believe science can't answer, rather than, say, a general moral compass and your own thoughts and reason of, say, an atheist?
I think I would say that as a Christian, I get some of my core values from Christianity, but of course I'm also engaging in dialogue with other ways of thinking as well. I mean, for example, I very often find that engaging in dialogue with my atheist friends does help me understand, first of all, what they think, and then, of course, helps me to sharpen up my own thinking. So I think that, if I can put it like this, it's extremely important, whether you are a religious believer or an atheist, to have intelligent, respectful conversations with other people, to try and understand what they think, and then work out whether there's anything they're saying, for example, that might be helpful in your own way of understanding the world. And that to me, I think, is a very important point. I mean, one thing that irritates me about Dawkins is he doesn't really seem to talk to religious believers very much. He has his own ideas of what they think. And then the result is, when religious believers read the God Delusion and say, well, that's not what we think at all. He's criticizing a straw man kind of thing. So I think there's a need to talk about this. And certainly, if you look at original Christianity, I mean, Christianity has always been in dialogue with, for example, Platonism or various other philosophical schools, to try and consolidate or enrich its own way of understanding, and of course to enter into dialogue with other positions. So I think there's a real richness of conversation that's possible there. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. In your book, you mentioned that Dawkins essentially ignores the forgiving and compassionate parts of the Old Testament, and specifically you say that he ignores the material that, for example, prohibits slavery, and you use the quote, well, Leviticus, which says, because the Israelites are my servants who are brought out of Egypt, and therefore they must not be sold as slaves. I believe this only prohibits the enslavement of the Israelites because they're God's chosen people. And in fact, in the next verse exactly, it goes on to say, your male and female slaves are to come from nations around you, and then from them you may buy slaves. They may become your property, and you may bequeath them to your kids. And to me, when I look at the Bible, that's just one example. You talk about it making the most sense for you. For me, this and several other quotes are more of a red flag. And surely, seeing as the Bible should be seen as a guide for a moral compass of a Christian, this would lead most people to thinking that doesn't make the most sense with our current morality.
Thank you. No, that's a good question. I think we need to talk about how Christians read the Old Testament, because Christians do see themselves being in continuity with the Old Testament, but Christians have always taken the view that when it comes to general moral principles like doing good, abstaining from evil, that's very, very important. When it comes to specific cultural or cultic requirements, then that's different, because in effect we've moved on from there. So I personally would not see, I would see this as a description of what Israel was like, say, 1,000 years before Christ. And that in effect is interesting, but it's not binding on me. And one of the problems I have really is that Dawkins draws excessively on a very narrow tranche of texts from the Old Testament. And certainly Old Testament scholars have written several books really being a little bit rude about Dawkins on this point. But I think your point is good, and I would say this very, very clearly. I mean, for example, the Old Testament includes some rather harsh stipulations, but Christians do not see these as being normative or binding in any way. That's what people thought back then. Now we move on. It's like this. If you like, it's about, to quote a passage from the Sermon on the Mount, Christ says that he's come not to abolish the law, but to perfect it. In other words, to show what it really means, how it is really to be lived out. And that really allows us to see things in a very different light. So I think what I would say to you is that I would certainly read those texts, and like you, I would say, I'm not living like that. I don't think people should live like that. That's the way it was back then. It's not the way it should be now. But there is this way of reading, this hermeneutic, if you like, which says that's the way it was. We've now moved on. It now looks like this. Thank you.
I was just wondering regarding your second point, what role do you personally believe philosophical arguments for God's existence play if we can't really prove if God exists?
I think that's a very good question. Again, thank you very much for it. And I would say, look, like most people, I've gone through these philosophical arguments, and I think that one of the things they do is they help us to realize what some of the issues are. They help us to realize actually it's quite difficult to define what God actually means, because very often a philosophical notion of God is very impersonal, very abstract. It's almost as if God is a thing in the world, a kind of a part of the world, an extra object in the world. Whereas, of course, for Christians, God is the ground of being, something that's kind of way, if you like, underlies the world, but not actually part of the world. But I think the reason why I think these arguments are so interesting is, first of all, they're all about whether religious belief in general can be shown to be rational. And obviously, it all depends on where you think these arguments take us. I personally don't think they take us very far, although they are very interesting. And you may know that Ludwig Wittgenstein, well-known philosopher of the early 20th century, said he had never actually met anybody who kind of way believed in God as a result of these arguments. But they are intellectually interesting. And I think it's very important to look at these and understand where they're coming from. But it does raise this very interesting and very difficult question, what God are we talking about? Because very often a philosophical notion of God is kind of way, something like the first principle of things, or the unmoved mover. And you may find aspects of that in a religious understanding of God, but actually a religious understanding of God is much more personal, much more engaging than that. So I think what I would say to you is that these arguments are interesting. They play an interesting role in my own thinking, because I think it's very important to engage with them. But I don't see them as being determinative, because they are actually, in effect, asking to what extent can human reason on its own argue its way towards the idea that there is a God. And I think we need a bit more help than that, even though an awful lot of people have a deep-seated intuitive belief that there is a God of some kind. I'm not sure these arguments actually help us clarify that in any great way. Thank you.
How are you doing with the time, Professor McGrath? Have you got enough time for maybe a couple more questions?
Yeah, we can keep going another 5 minutes, please.
Well, yeah, Bruce.
Mr. McGrath, you mentioned the Soviet Union and how its lack of an official state religion is somehow responsible for its tyrannical regime. Surely this is completely incomparable to the motivation of jihadists, such as those of 9/11, or Christian extremists such as the IRA, who very specifically and proudly invoke God, often even at the very time they commit these acts of terror and evil.
Well, that's right. And one of the points I make very, very clear is that I have no doubt that those guys who flew those planes into those buildings were doing so for religious reasons in the name of God. I think that is, in my view, deplorable. But my point about the Soviet Union, I'm afraid, is fair. Because, as you will probably know, in the 1920s, a program to eradicate religion began to take place in the Soviet Union, because they were unable to persuade people that that there was no God. So in fact, they had to use methods of violence to do it. And the academic studies are there. You can read them, the number of churches that were dynamited, the number of priests that were imprisoned or executed. It's all there. And I'm afraid it was about the forcible suppression of religion. And I think it should surprise us, because if you're a sociologist, you'll say, well, actually, the Soviet Union actually behaved as if Marxism, Leninism was a kind of religion. In effect, you had to agree with it. If you didn't agree with it, then in effect, you would close them down. So unfortunately, I'm afraid, I do think that history does bear this out. I think it also is very, very interesting to look at what happened in the Soviet Union once it collapsed, and note what the situation is now under Putin and others, because it just shows that situations can be reversed. But let me make it absolutely clear, I object strongly to anybody imposing their views on anyone else and using violence. I'm an academic. For me, the important thing is to talk about these things, and that's how we settle these arguments.
Okay, we'll go to the final question. Ali?
Hello, sir. Thank you for coming. So my question will be, science is something that it can be proved false and just change and just improve on the argument. Do you think religion do the same thing?
That's a very good question. And again, you're probably getting Karl Popper in this very important idea, or you have to be able to falsify something. Science ought to be able to set out its ideas in a way that you can show that they are wrong. Because if they're wrong, then we move on to something else. I think that's very important. In the case of religion, I'm afraid it's more fuzzy. I think this is probably the point that lies behind your question, that, for example, we would have to say, well, how could we prove or disprove the existence of God? I think that's very, very difficult. There are points in the New Testament where some of the writings do seem to say, well, look, if you can show you're wrong on this, then the whole thing's wrong. For example, and St. Paul says, look, if the resurrection is wrong, well, that's it. We all go home. It's the end of it. The problem is, how do we actually show that that's right? But again, it's a very good point you're making. The real problem is that when Karl Popper began to have to show what sort of things could be falsified, actually turned out to be rather more complicated than he thought. And I think that what we can say is that science, is on a journey, and sometimes it takes wrong turns, it corrects itself. And I think religion does show similar tendencies. If you look at the history of religion, you will see at points, at least in certain parts of the world, it moves in this direction. That turns out to be bad, so you move in a different direction. So there is this propensity to be able to self-correct. But there's no direct equivalent, I think, to this idea of being able to falsify things and hence move on. I think that it's just a bit more fuzzy than that, I'm afraid. But a very good question, and thank you for asking it.
Okay, over to you.
Perfect. Well, I'd just like to say on behalf of the Philippa Foot Society today that thank you so much for coming. It's been a really great talk, really insightful and useful for us all. I know a lot of us are really looking forward to not just apply this to our A-level course, but also take on a perhaps, I don't know, more relaxed attitude towards the compatibility of science and religion. So yeah, thank you very much.